The whistle of the approaching train pierced the crisp autumn air as Katherine Bailey clutched her small valise with trembling hands. 6 months pregnant and abandoned by the man who had promised her the world. She had nowhere to go and no one waiting for her at Clearwater Station, Wyoming Territory. 1873. Katherine's eyes darted nervously across the platform as passengers disembarked around her. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the dusty wooden boards beneath her feet. Her heart raced as she realized the gravity of her situation. Thomas had promised to meet her here, to marry her before her condition became obvious to everyone. His last letter had been so convincing, so full of promises about their future together in this frontier town. Yet here she stood, alone, with no sign of the father of her unborn child. Last call for passengers continuing to Cheyenne. The conductor shouted, making Katherine flinch. She had spent her last dollars on this one-way ticket. There was no going back to Boston, no returning to the family who had disowned her when they discovered her condition. She clutched her stomach protectively as another passenger bumped into her, not even bothering to apologize as they hurried past. As the train whistle blew again, and the great iron beast pulled away from the station, Katherine felt the last of her hope leave with it. The platform emptied quickly, leaving her standing alone with her small bag of possessions. The station master gave her a curious look as he prepared to close up for the evening. "Madam, you waiting for someone?" he asked, his voice tinged with suspicion as his eyes lingered on her swollen middle. "Yes," she lied, her voice barely above a whisper. "They should be here any minute." The man nodded doubtfully and returned to his office, leaving Katherine alone once more. Night was falling fast, and with it came a chill that cut through her thin coat. She sank onto a bench, fighting back tears that threatened to spill over. What would become of her and her child now? Flynn Carter rode into Clearwater just as the last light of day disappeared beyond the mountains. He hadn't planned to come to town today, but a broken wagon wheel had forced him to seek out the blacksmith. By the time the repair was finished, it was too late to start the journey back to his ranch. He'd stable his horse for the night and head back at first light. As he rode past the station, something caught his eye. A woman sat alone on the bench, her posture suggesting both exhaustion and desperation. Flynn wasn't one to get involved in other people's business. Life on the frontier had taught him that minding his own affairs was often the safest course. But something about the solitary figure tugged at him. He reined in his horse and dismounted, approaching slowly so as not to frighten her. "Evening, madam," he said, tipping his hat. "Station's closed for the night. You waiting on someone?" Katherine looked up, startled by the deep voice. The man before her was tall and broad-shouldered, with a weathered face that spoke of years under the harsh Wyoming sun. His eyes, however, were a startling blue that reminded her of the ocean she had left behind. Yes," she stammered, the lie feeling bitter on her tongue. "But I fear they're not coming." Flynn took in her appearance. The quality of her clothes suggested she wasn't from around these parts, but they were wrinkled from travel. Her hands nervously smoothed the fabric over her rounded stomach, and understanding dawned on him. "You got somewhere to stay for the night?" he asked, already guessing the answer. Katherine shook her head, unable to speak as tears finally spilled down her cheeks. Flynn Carter wasn't a man who acted impulsively. 6 years of solitude following his return from the war had made him cautious and reserved. But he couldn't leave this woman alone at the station with night falling and temperatures dropping. "Name's Flynn Carter," he said, offering a calloused hand. "I own a ranch about 7 miles outside of town. I can't in good conscience leave you here. You're welcome to stay in my guest room tonight, and tomorrow we can figure out your situation." Katherine hesitated. Her mother had warned her about the dangers of trusting strangers, especially men. But what choice did she have? "Katherine Bailey," she replied, accepting his hand. "And I'm afraid I've been a fool, Mr. Carter. The man who promised to meet me here, who promised to marry me, he's not coming." Flynn's jaw tightened. He'd seen it before, women lured to the frontier with promises of marriage, only to be abandoned when their condition became inconvenient. The territory was full of men without honor. "Well, Miss Bailey, seems to me you've had enough disappointment for one day. Let's get you somewhere warm for the night, and things might look brighter in the morning." He helped her to her feet and picked up her small bag, surprised by how light it was. Everything she owned in the world, he suspected, was in that valise. The ride to Flynn's ranch was mostly silent. Katherine, wrapped in a blanket Flynn had produced from his saddlebag, sat in front of him on the horse, her back stiff with tension. Flynn kept a respectful distance as much as possible while ensuring she wouldn't fall. As they crested a hill, the outline of Flynn's ranch came into view under the moonlight, a sturdy cabin with a barn and corral beside it. It wasn't grand, but it was well maintained, suggesting its owner took pride in his property. "It's not much," Flynn said, breaking the silence, "but it's solid and warm." "It looks wonderful," Katherine replied honestly. After the day she'd had, any shelter seemed like a palace. Once inside, Flynn quickly built up the fire while Katherine stood awkwardly in the center of the main room, unsure what to do with herself. The cabin was simple but clean, with a few pieces of sturdy furniture and surprisingly homey touches: a colorful quilt draped over a chair, a shelf of well-worn books. "Are you hungry?" Flynn asked, moving to the kitchen area. "I've got some stew I can heat up." Katherine nodded gratefully, suddenly aware of how long it had been since she'd eaten. As Flynn prepared their late supper, she sank into a chair by the fire, the warmth seeping into her tired bones. "How far along are you?" Flynn asked quietly as he placed a bowl of steaming stew in front of her. 6 months, Katherine answered, surprised by his directness but appreciative of it as well. "The baby is due in January." Flynn nodded, taking the seat opposite her. "And the father?" Katherine's hands trembled slightly as she picked up her spoon. "Thomas Wheaton. We met in Boston, where I worked as a seamstress in his mother's shop. He came west 6 months ago to establish himself, promised to send for me when he was settled." Her voice grew bitter. "When he discovered I was with child, his letters became less frequent, then stopped altogether. The last one contained money for a train ticket and directions to meet him here." Flynn's expression darkened. "Thomas Wheaton," he repeated. "Blond fellow, talks with a bit of an accent like he's trying to sound more educated than he is." Katherine's eyes widened. "You know him?" "Passed through about 4 months ago," Flynn confirmed. "Spent a few weeks in town throwing money around, courting the banker's daughter. Left suddenly about a month back. Word is he headed further west, maybe California." The news hit Katherine like a physical blow. She had suspected Thomas had abandoned her, but hearing confirmation that he had been here, had courted another woman while she carried his child, was devastating. The spoon clattered from her hand back into the bowl. Flynn cursed himself for his bluntness. "I'm sorry, Miss Bailey. That was poorly handled on my part." Katherine shook her head, gathering her composure. "No, Mr. Carter, I appreciate the truth, however painful. It seems I've been living with lies for too long already." They finished their meal in silence. Afterward, Flynn showed her to the small guest room. It was sparse but clean, with a narrow bed covered with another handmade quilt. "Bathroom's out back," he explained. "There's a wash basin here if you need it. I'll be up at dawn to tend to the animals, but you sleep as long as you need." "Thank you," Katherine said softly. "I don't know how I'll repay your kindness." Flynn shook his head. Get some rest, Miss Bailey. Tomorrow's soon enough to worry about what comes next. As he closed the door, leaving her alone, Katherine finally allowed herself to fully comprehend her situation. She was alone, pregnant, and penniless in a town where she knew no one except this solemn cowboy who had offered her shelter. She lay down on the bed, too exhausted to even undress, and surrendered to sleep. Flynn sat by the dying fire long after Katherine had gone to bed. He was a man who valued his solitude, who had built a life around needing no one, and being needed by no one in return. The war had taken something from him, not just his left leg below the knee, which had been replaced with a wooden prosthetic he'd learned to use so well most folks never noticed his limp, but also his faith in humanity. He'd returned to find his parents dead from influenza, and their small ranch nearly in ruins. Through sheer determination, he'd rebuilt it into a modest but successful operation, raising cattle and horses with only occasional hired help during busy seasons. He kept to himself, made the monthly trip into Clearwater for supplies, and otherwise lived a life of quiet routine. Now, he'd brought a pregnant, abandoned woman into his home. What had he been thinking? Tomorrow, he decided, he would take her back to town, perhaps speak to the pastor's wife about finding her a situation. That would be the sensible thing to do. But as he banked the fire for the night and headed to his own bedroom, Flynn couldn't help but remember the look of desperate gratitude in Katherine's eyes when he'd offered her shelter. It had been a long time since he'd felt needed by another human being. The feeling wasn't entirely unpleasant. Morning came with the crow of Flynn's rooster. Katherine woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was until the events of the previous day came rushing back. She sat up slowly, her back aching from the long journey and her awkward position during sleep. Through the small window, she could see Flynn already at work in the yard, carrying feed to the animals. She quickly freshened up using the wash basin and changed into her only other dress, a simple blue cotton that strained slightly across her growing middle. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found a pot of coffee on the stove and a plate of biscuits on the table, still warm from the oven. Flynn came in shortly after, stomping dust from his boots at the door. "Good morning," he said, seeming surprised to find her up. "Did you sleep well?" "Better than I expected to," Katherine admitted. "Thank you for breakfast. I hope you don't mind that I helped myself." "That's what it's there for," he replied, pouring himself a cup of coffee. He studied her over the rim of his cup, noting the dark circles under her eyes despite her claim of good sleep. "I thought we might ride into town today, see about finding you a more permanent arrangement." Katherine's heart sank, though she knew she couldn't expect more from this man who had already shown her such kindness. "Of course," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I've imposed on your hospitality long enough." Flynn frowned slightly, sensing her distress. "It's not that," he clarified. "Just figured you might prefer the company of other women, especially in your condition. Pastor Wilson's wife is known for taking in those in need." "I see," Katherine said, relief and something like disappointment mingling in her chest. The thought of being a charity case, passed from one benefactor to another, was humiliating. But what alternative did she have? As if reading her thoughts, Flynn continued, "Unless you have other ideas. Do you have any skills that might help you find work?" Katherine straightened in her chair. "I'm an excellent seamstress," she said with pride. "I worked in one of Boston's finest dress shops before." She trailed off, her hand unconsciously moving to her stomach. Flynn nodded thoughtfully. "Clearwater's growing. Might be a need for someone with your skills. We could ask around while we're in town." The ride into Clearwater was easier in daylight. Katherine, feeling somewhat refreshed after a night's sleep, took in her surroundings with interest. The landscape was so different from the crowded streets of Boston, vast and open, with mountains rising in the distance and rolling grasslands stretching as far as the eye could see. Flynn's ranch, she noticed in the light of day, was well positioned near a creek, with good pastureland for his cattle. The cabin and outbuildings were modest but sturdy, speaking of a man who valued function over appearance but took pride in his work. Clearwater itself was a small but growing settlement, a main street lined with wooden buildings, a church with a white steeple, a schoolhouse, and scattered residences. It wasn't the bustling town Thomas had described in his letters, but it had a certain frontier charm. Flynn helped Katherine down from his horse in front of the general store. "Thought we might start here," he explained. "Mrs. Henderson runs the place since her husband passed. If anyone knows where there might be work for a seamstress, it'd be her." The bell above the door jangled as they entered. The store was well stocked with everything from food staples to tools, fabric, and household goods. A plump, gray-haired woman looked up from behind the counter, her face brightening at the sight of Flynn. "Flynn Carter, twice in 1 month. To what do we owe this pleasure?" Her curious eyes moved to Katherine, taking in her condition with a quick, assessing glance. "Mrs. Henderson, this is Miss Katherine Bailey. She's new to town and looking for work as a seamstress. Thought you might know if anyone's in need of such skills." Mrs. Henderson extended a hand to Katherine. "Martha Henderson, dear. Always nice to see a new face in Clearwater." Her handshake was firm and warm. "As for sewing work, I might have some ideas. The Wilsons are expecting their 5th child, and Mrs. Wilson was just saying yesterday how she hasn't had time to make baby clothes, and Mrs. Porter at the hotel is always complaining about needing curtains and linens mended." Katherine felt a surge of hope. "I can do all of that. I specialize in ladies' garments, but I'm proficient in all types of sewing." Mrs. Henderson smiled approvingly. "And where are you staying, dear?" Katherine hesitated, looking to Flynn. "She's at my place for now," Flynn said, his tone matter-of-fact but challenging anyone to make something of it. "Just until she gets settled." Mrs. Henderson's eyebrows rose slightly, but she was too practical a woman to create drama where help was needed. "Well, I'd be happy to put the word out that we have a skilled seamstress in town. In the meantime, I've got some mending myself that's been piling up. Would you be interested, Miss Bailey?" "Very much so," Katherine replied eagerly. By the time they left the general store, Katherine had a bundle of mending work and promises of more to come. Mrs. Henderson had also suggested she speak with Mr. Davis at the bank about possibly renting one of the small cabins on the edge of town once she had some income established. "That went better than expected," Flynn remarked as they walked down the boardwalk toward the bank. "Yes," Katherine agreed, clutching the bundle of mending to her chest like a treasure. "Everyone seems so kind here." Flynn's expression turned wry. "Folks are curious about a newcomer, especially one in your condition. There'll be talk." Katherine's step faltered slightly. "About me being unwed and with child." "About that," Flynn nodded, "and about you staying at my place. Small towns run on gossip, Miss Bailey." Katherine considered this as they continued walking. She had no illusions about how she would be viewed. An unwed mother was scandalous even in a frontier town. But the alternative had been so much worse. "I can find somewhere else to stay," she offered. "I wouldn't want to damage your reputation." Flynn let out a short laugh. "My reputation isn't much to worry about. Besides, you heard Mrs. Henderson, those cabins won't be available until you've earned some money." They reached the bank, where Mr. Davis confirmed what Mrs. Henderson had said about the rental cabins. He seemed less welcoming than the storekeeper, eyeing Katherine with barely disguised disapproval, but was professional enough when Flynn explained her situation. As they left the bank, Flynn suggested they visit the pastor's wife as well, just to explore all options. The church was at the end of the main street, a simple white building with the parsonage beside it. Mrs. Wilson, a thin, energetic woman with 4 children ranging from toddler to teen, welcomed them warmly. When Flynn explained Katherine's circumstances, carefully omitting any mention of Thomas Wheaton, Mrs. Wilson immediately began making plans. "You must join us for Sunday services," she insisted. "The community will want to welcome you properly. And yes, I'm in desperate need of baby clothes. My sewing skills are adequate at best, and with 4 children already, time is scarce." Katherine found herself agreeing to attend services and promising to start on baby clothes as soon as possible. Mrs. Wilson seemed genuinely kind, though Katherine noted the slight disappointment in her eyes when Flynn made it clear Katherine would be staying at his ranch for the time being rather than at the parsonage. By mid-afternoon, they had visited most of the important places in town, and Katherine had a promising start on establishing herself. As they prepared to ride back to the ranch, Flynn stopped at the blacksmith's to check on his repaired wagon wheel. "Should be ready by tomorrow," the blacksmith informed him. "I'll have my boy bring it out to your place." Flynn nodded his thanks, and they mounted his horse for the return journey. As they rode, Katherine found herself studying the back of Flynn's neck. The way his dark hair curled slightly where it met his collar, the strong set of his shoulders. He was not handsome in the conventional way Thomas had been, with his fair hair and smooth charm, but there was something compelling about Flynn's rugged features and quiet strength. "Thank you," she said suddenly, "for everything you've done today, for last night." Flynn glanced back at her, surprise evident in his blue eyes. "Just doing what anyone would do," he replied. "No," Katherine contradicted him gently. "Not anyone. You didn't have to help me, and yet you did. I won't forget it." Flynn returned his gaze to the path ahead, but Katherine thought she saw a slight softening around his mouth, the ghost of a smile playing at the corners of his lips. The next few weeks established a routine. Katherine stayed in Flynn's guest room, insisting on earning her keep by cooking and keeping the cabin tidy, while Flynn worked outside with his cattle and horses. Each day, she would sew for several hours, working through the growing pile of mending and commission work that came her way as word spread of her skills. Twice a week, Flynn would take her into town to deliver completed work and pick up new orders. The people of Clearwater gradually became accustomed to seeing them together, and while there was certainly gossip about the nature of their arrangement, most folks were practical enough to understand the necessity of it. Katherine found herself settling into life at the ranch with surprising ease. The simple routine, the quiet evenings by the fire where Flynn might read while she sewed, the shared meals where they slowly began to learn more about each other, all of it had a comforting rhythm that helped heal the wound of Thomas's betrayal. Flynn, too, found himself adjusting to having another person in his space. At first, he had maintained a careful distance, speaking little and retiring early to give Katherine privacy. But as days turned to weeks, he found himself lingering longer at the dinner table, sharing stories of his time in the Army, his childhood in Wyoming before it was even a territory, his dreams for the ranch. In turn, Katherine told him about her life in Boston, the death of her parents that had left her alone at 19, her work as a seamstress, and eventually how she had met Thomas Wheaton. "He came into the shop to order shirts," she explained one evening as they sat by the fire. "He was so charming, so interested in me. No one had ever paid me that kind of attention before." She looked down at her hands, twisting in her lap. "I was naive. I believed all his promises." Flynn's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice gentle. "That doesn't make you naive." It makes him dishonorable." Catherine's eyes filled with tears. "I keep wondering what I'll tell my child about their father." "You'll tell them the truth when they're old enough to understand," Flynn said. "And until then, they'll know they're loved and cared for. That's what matters most." October gave way to November, and the weather turned colder. Catherine's condition became more pronounced, her movements slower and more careful. Flynn found himself watching her with concern, especially when she insisted on continuing her regular tasks despite her growing discomfort. One morning, Flynn came in from the barn to find Katherine struggling to reach a pot on a high shelf, her rounded belly making it difficult to get close enough to the cabinet. "Let me," he said, moving quickly to her side and easily retrieving the pot. Their hands brushed as he handed it to her, and for a moment, neither moved away. "Thank you," Katherine said softly, her eyes meeting his. Something passed between them, a recognition of how comfortable they had become with each other, how natural it felt to share this space. Flynn cleared his throat and stepped back. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice gruffer than he intended. "Winter's coming on fast. Those cabins in town aren't well insulated. Might not be the best place for you and the baby." Katherine set the pot on the stove, her back to him so he couldn't see her expression. "What are you suggesting?" Flynn ran a hand through his hair, suddenly uncertain. This wasn't how he had planned to bring up the subject. "Just that you might consider staying here, at least through the winter. The baby will come in January, and traveling back and forth to town in the snow with a newborn wouldn't be wise." Katherine turned to face him, her expression carefully neutral. "That's very generous, Flynn, but I've imposed on you long enough. Once the baby comes—" "It's not an imposition," Flynn interrupted. "The cabin feels right with you in it." He looked away, embarrassed by his own words. "That came out wrong. I just mean I've gotten used to having you around, and I worry about you being alone in town when your time comes." Katherine studied him, trying to read beyond his awkward words. Over the weeks, she had come to admire this quiet, honorable man who had opened his home to her, without asking for anything in return. She had seen his gentleness with his animals, his unwavering work ethic, the thoughtful way he considered problems. She had also noticed the limp he tried to hide, the wooden leg he never mentioned, the nightmares that sometimes had him pacing the cabin in the dark hours when he thought she was asleep. "If you're sure," she said finally, "I would be grateful to stay, at least until spring." Flynn nodded, relief evident in his posture. "Good, that's good." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Katherine," he said, the use of her first name still rare enough to make her heart beat faster, "I'm glad you got off that train in Clearwater." Before she could respond, he was gone, back to his chores, leaving her standing in the kitchen with a strange warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with her pregnancy or the stove's heat. December brought snow and bitter cold. The trips to town became less frequent as travel grew more difficult. Flynn spent much of his time ensuring the animals were properly sheltered and fed, often coming in from the cold with his beard frosted and his hands chapped despite his gloves. Katherine kept the cabin warm and welcoming, adding small touches that transformed the functional space into a home. She had used some of her earnings to purchase fabric and had made curtains for the windows, new cushions for the chairs, even a small rag doll that sat waiting for her child's arrival. As Christmas approached, the reality of her situation began to weigh on her again. This would be her child's first Christmas, albeit one they would experience from the safety of her womb. What kind of life could she provide as an unwed mother in a frontier town? The work had been steady so far, but would it continue once the novelty of her presence wore off? Flynn noticed her preoccupation one evening as she sat by the fire, her sewing forgotten in her lap, staring into the flames. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, setting aside the ledger where he had been calculating his cattle inventory. Katherine smiled faintly. "I'm not sure they're worth that much. Try me," she sighed, one hand resting on her stomach where the baby was particularly active tonight. "I was thinking about the future. What happens after winter, after the baby comes?" Flynn leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You're worried about supporting yourself and the child." It wasn't a question, but Katherine nodded anyway. "The work has been good, but I don't know if it will be enough, and finding a place to live in town." She trailed off, not wanting to sound ungrateful for all he had already done. Flynn was quiet for a long moment, staring down at his hands. When he looked up, his expression was resolute but nervous. "What if you didn't have to leave?" he asked quietly. Katherine's heart seemed to stop. "What do you mean?" Flynn stood up abruptly, moving to the window to stare out at the snowy landscape, his back to her. "I'm not good with words, Katherine, never have been, but these past months having you here." He turned to face her. "The cabin was just a place to sleep before, now it's a home." Katherine set aside her sewing, her hands trembling slightly. "Flynn, what are you saying?" He crossed the room in 3 strides, dropping to one knee beside her chair, his face level with hers. "I'm saying I'd like you to stay, permanently. As my wife, if you'll have me." Katherine's breath caught in her throat. "But the baby would be mine in every way that matters," Flynn finished for her. "I know I'm not much to look at, and my leg." He gestured vaguely toward his left leg, the first time he had ever acknowledged his injury to her. "But I promise I'd be a good husband to you and a good father to your child." Tears filled Katherine's eyes. "You would do that? Take on another man's child as your own?" Flynn reached out tentatively, taking her hand in his. "Katherine, in these few months you've brought more life and warmth to this place than I thought possible. I find myself thinking of you when you're not in the room, looking forward to our conversations, missing you when you're in town without me." His voice grew softer. "I think I've fallen in love with you. Both of you," he added, his other hand gently touching her rounded belly. The baby chose that moment to kick against his palm, making Flynn's eyes widen in wonder. Katherine couldn't help but laugh through her tears at his expression. "I'm not asking out of pity or duty," Flynn continued, his eyes sincere as they met hers again. "I'm asking because I want this a life with you, a family, if you need time to think about it." "No," Katherine interrupted, squeezing his hand. "I don't need time. I've seen the kind of man you are, Flynn Carter. Honorable, kind, hardworking. Any woman would be fortunate to call you husband." She took a deep breath. "And I find that I've fallen in love with you too." Flynn's face transformed with a smile that made him look years younger. "Is that a yes?" "Yes," Katherine whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." They were married 3 days before Christmas in the small church in Clearwater. Mrs. Wilson had insisted on helping Katherine create a wedding dress, cleverly designed to accommodate her advanced pregnancy while still looking elegant. The entire town turned out for the ceremony, curiosity mingling with genuine well-wishes for the couple who had become a source of local gossip and admiration. Pastor Wilson kept the service brief out of consideration for Katherine's condition, but his words were meaningful as he spoke of love that grows from respect and kindness, of families created through choice rather than just blood, of the sacred commitment they were making to each other and to the child who would soon join them. When Flynn kissed his bride, there wasn't a dry eye in the church. Even Mr. Davis from the bank was seen discreetly wiping away a tear, though he would later deny it vehemently. The holiday season passed in a blur of quiet joy. Flynn surprised Katherine with a beautiful cradle he had been secretly building in the barn. Its wooden surface sanded smooth and polished to a warm glow. Katherine, in turn, presented him with a new winter coat she had made from heavy wool, lined with flannel and perfectly fitted to his broad shoulders. As January arrived with its fierce storms and bone-chilling temperatures, Catherine's time drew near. Flynn arranged for Mrs. Wilson to stay with them as the birth approached, unwilling to risk Katherine being alone if her labor started while he was tending to the animals. It was just past midnight on January 15th when Katherine woke Flynn with a hand on his shoulder and 4 quiet words. "It's time. The baby." The next 12 hours were the most terrifying of Flynn's life. He paced outside the bedroom door as Mrs. Wilson and Martha Henderson, who had arrived shortly after being summoned, attended to Katherine. Her cries of pain tore at his heart, making him feel helpless in a way he hadn't experienced since the war, when he'd lain wounded on the battlefield, unable to help the men dying around him. Just when he thought he couldn't bear another moment, the cabin filled with a new sound, the strong, indignant cry of a newborn. Flynn froze in his tracks, his heart hammering against his ribs. A few minutes later, the bedroom door opened and Martha Henderson appeared, her face tired but beaming. "You have a son, Flynn," she announced. "A beautiful, healthy boy. Katherine is asking for you." Flynn entered the bedroom on unsteady legs. Katherine lay propped against pillows, her face pale and exhausted but radiant with joy. In her arms was a small bundle wrapped in one of the blankets she had made. "Come meet your son," she whispered as Flynn approached the bed. He sat carefully on the edge of the mattress, afraid to disturb either of them. Katherine folded back the blanket to reveal a tiny, red face topped with a surprising amount of dark hair. "He looks like you," Katherine said with a tired smile. "Isn't that remarkable?" Flynn stared in wonder at the infant. He had imagined this moment many times over the past months, had worried about whether he would feel a true connection to another man's child. But as he gazed at the tiny boy, all he felt was overwhelming love and protectiveness. "Would you like to hold him?" Katherine asked. Flynn nodded, suddenly unable to speak. With careful guidance from Katherine, he took the small bundle into his arms. The baby squirmed slightly, then settled against his chest. "What shall we call him?" Flynn asked, his voice rough with emotion. Katherine watched the two of them, her heart so full it felt it might burst. "I was thinking William, after my father. William Flynn Carter." Flynn looked up, surprised. "You want to give him my name?" "Of course," Katherine replied. "You are his father in every way that matters." "Unless you'd prefer something else." Flynn shook his head, looking back down at the baby at William. "William Flynn Carter," he repeated softly. "It's perfect. He's perfect." He leaned forward to press a gentle kiss to Katherine's forehead. "Thank you for this gift." The weeks following William's birth were a blur of exhaustion and joy. Katherine recovered quickly, but the demands of a newborn transformed their routine completely. Flynn took on as many of the night feedings as he could, sitting in the rocking chair he had procured from town, cradling his son while Katherine got much-needed rest. As winter gave way to spring, William grew stronger and more alert. His dark hair and blue eyes were remarked upon by everyone who visited, many noting the striking resemblance to Flynn, despite knowing the child was not his by blood. "It's as if he was meant to be yours all along," Mrs. Wilson commented during one visit. Flynn, watching Katherine nurse their son by the window, sunlight creating a halo around them both, couldn't help but agree. Whatever force had brought Katherine to that train station on that particular autumn day had changed his life in ways he could never have imagined. By William's 6-month birthday in July, the ranch was thriving. Flynn had hired 2 hands to help with the expanded herd, allowing him more time to spend with his family. Katherine had established a small but steady business creating clothes for the growing population of Clearwater, working from a corner of their cabin that Flynn had transformed into a sewing area. complete with large windows for optimal light. On a warm evening in late summer, they sat together on the porch, William sleeping peacefully in Catherine's arms. The setting sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and purple, and the air was sweet with the scent of wild sage. "You ever regret it?" Katherine asked suddenly. "Taking in a pregnant stranger, making her your wife, raising her child as your own." Flynn took her free hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "Regret the best decision I ever made, not for a single moment." He smiled, that rare, transformative smile that still made her heart skip. "Though I do wonder sometimes what would have happened if I hadn't ridden past the station that evening." Katherine leaned her head against his shoulder. "I was so afraid that day, so lost. I keep thinking about what would have happened to William and me if you hadn't stopped." Flynn pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "You would have found a way. You're the strongest woman I know, Katherine Carter." She smiled at the sound of her married name, still new enough to bring a thrill. "Perhaps, but I'm grateful every day that I didn't have to find out." She hesitated, then added, "I have something to tell you." Flynn pulled back slightly to look at her face. "Is everything all right?" Katherine's smile widened. "More than all right. Dr. Simmons confirmed it yesterday when I was in town." She took a deep breath. "We're going to have another baby, Flynn, in early spring." Flynn's expression transformed from concern to utter joy in an instant. "A baby. Our baby," Katherine nodded, tears of happiness filling her eyes. "Our baby." Flynn gathered her and William carefully into his arms, mindful not to wake their son. "I love you," he whispered against her hair. "Both of you. All three of you," he corrected himself with a laugh. "And we love you," Katherine replied, her heart full to bursting. "Our protector, our provider, our home." As twilight deepened into night, the family remained on the porch, bathed in the soft glow of lantern light. From such uncertain beginnings, an abandoned woman, a lonely cowboy, a chance encounter at a train station had grown a love strong enough to withstand whatever challenges life might bring. And in the safety of that love, a family had found its true home. The following spring, just as the first wildflowers began to carpet the Wyoming prairie, Katherine gave birth to a daughter they named Elizabeth Martha Carter, her middle name a tribute to the kind storekeeper who had helped them establish their new life. With William now a sturdy toddler eager to meet his baby sister, the Carter household expanded once more with love and laughter. Over the years, the ranch prospered, as did the town of Clearwater. Flynn and Katherine welcomed two more children, twins James and Sarah, completing their family. William grew into a young man who inherited his adoptive father's quiet strength and honor, never questioning his place in the family, even after learning the truth of his birth when he was old enough to understand. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Flynn presented Katherine with a locket containing miniature portraits of their 4 children. As he fastened it around her neck, his hand still strong but now weathered by 2 decades of ranch work, he whispered, "Thank you for getting off that train." Katherine turned in his arms, her face as beautiful to him as the day he had found her alone at the station. "Thank you for stopping," she replied, rising on tiptoe to kiss the man who had transformed her greatest moment of despair into a lifetime of happiness. And on the mantelpiece of their expanded ranch house, in a place of honor, sat a small valise, the same one Katherine had clutched with trembling hands all those years ago, kept as a reminder of how the most unexpected journeys could lead exactly where you were meant to be all along.